In the last episode, we described the fall of Richard, and we were trying to locate that exact moment when it happens. We know that the deposition scene is the formal shift when Richard hands Henry the hollow crown. And of course, the deposition scene also has that marvelous moment when Richard asks for a mirror, and that mirror, if you remember, is the speculum principium, right? It's the mirror of princes. It's a literary genre in its own right, where a king or a ruler is asked to reflect upon his kingship or the way he rules as a prince. And Richard, we know, has been gazing in the wrong mirrors, right? He's been gazing in Narcissus's pool. He's been gazing at himself and falling in love with his own self through the flattery of his entourage. But that moment, Richard looks upon himself. It makes you think about how he never reflected truly on his kingship. He was too impulsive, right? There's too much self-love, and that ultimately brings him down. But the actual shift, we noted, was far more ambiguous, and we saw how Richard leads Henry into his decision. Now I'd like to talk about how this ambiguous shift is reflected in the printed books. I want to show you how printers dealt with this ambiguous switching of kings. It's all in the speech prefixes. A speech prefix is the name designating the actor's part, and usually it's an abbreviation in the original books. So let's look at how the early modern books, versions of the play, dealt with the shift from one king to the other. Now, your edition, the Norton one that we have been using for this class, is based on the first folio, and you remember the first folio. And the quartos from our Hamlet class, like remember this big one is the folio, and then this little guy, if you remember, was the quarto, and it's the little paperback version of it. Your edition is very much clearly a first folio version, except for in the beginning of the speech prefixes. So let me show you. Looking at your edition, it begins with Richard, and then it has Bolingbroke, Richard, and Bolingbroke. But that's not exactly how the first folio begins. The first folio's first stage direction says, "Enter King Richard." And then the first speech prefixes begin, King Richard, King, King, right? And that's an actual abbreviation right there. As for Bolingbroke, he enters here, enter Bolingbroke, and then it says the speech prefix Bolingbroke, Bol for Bolingbroke. And it goes over here as well, Bolingbroke. That's just a slight difference between the first folio and your edition, since your edition immediately begins with Richard. Richard doesn't appear until Act 1, Scene 3. Here's Act 1, Scene 3. We make a note that it's the folio that introduces the act and scene breaks. The quartos do not have act and scene breaks. The quartos read like Hollywood movies. They're very quick. They just have scenes. Anyway, in this third act, we note Richard's name first appears as a speech prefix, even though in the stage directions it says enter king. And then from then on, it's always enter King Richard, Richard, right down to Richard and Bolingbroke speaking to each other. As a rule, I'm a paperback novel reader. I don't usually read big, heavy volumes like this. I tend to read volumes like this so I can write into them and destroy them, and it doesn't matter. And what I noticed about my paperback novel was in the speech prefixes. Look at how mine opens. You can see right off the bat that mine says enter King Richard, and then it says king, and then it says king. I found out later that this paperback version was a mixture of the first quarto and the fourth quarto, or Q1 and Q4. So let's look at the first quarto to see how printers deal with the ambiguous switching of roles in Richard II. The stage directions are quite large. Enter King Richard, John of Gaunt, with other nobles' attendants. Then the first, I guess we call the stage prefix, King Richard, and then it continues on king and king. Conventionally, plays that have anything to do with royalty will always designate the main king characters and queen characters by their titles king and queen. So there should be some expectations we're going to have a king. Now look at when Bolingbroke enters with Mowbray. We have our Bolingbroke, just like we have in your edition. Once Richard calls on Mowbray and Bolingbroke to appear before him, your version says Richard, but in the first quarto, it still says King Bolingbroke, king. Now it gets interesting. We're back in the courtyard. Do you remember this scene? Set on towards London, cousin, is it so? Bolingbroke, yea, my lord. Richard, then I must not say no, and that's the moment. Look at how Q1 renders this. It's still going to be King and Bolingbroke at this moment. Yea, my good lord, then I must say no, Bolingbroke and king. Now to get the full effect, I want you to remember what Northumberland says. This is a war council, remember. The news is very fair and good, my lord. Richard not far from hence hath hid his head, and York replies in anger, it would beseem the Lord Northumberland to say, King Richard, alack the heavy day when such a sacred king should hide his head. Northumberland, your grace mistakes only to be brief, left I his title out. Is it a mistake to forget to include the king's title when discussing a king? Let's look at the moment when Bolingbroke intends to ascend the throne. Ascend his throne, descending now from him, and long live Henry of that name the fourth. Bolingbroke, in God's name I'll ascend the regal throne. And then of course the Bishop Carlisle says, Mary, heaven forbid. In God's name, does Henry believe in its sacredness? This is what it looks like in Q1. Look at Bolingbroke, the speech prefix. In God's name, I'll ascend the regal throne. And Carlisle, Mary, God forbid. And Carlisle, the bishop, will denounce this ascendancy, this rising of fortune's wheel, right? And on line 130, he offers a prophecy. And if you crown him, let me prophesy. The blood of English shall manure the ground, and future ages groan for his foul act. That's like Bolingbroke's threat of a summer of showering blood. It also prefigures the original tetralogy, right? Which is about Henry VI losing control over England. What happens to Carlisle, of course, is he's arrested. Then we look across the page, and Bolingbroke suddenly proclaims his coronation. So there's your Bolingbroke, in God's name I'll ascend the regal throne. Carlisle saying, Mary, God forbid. And then we turn the page, or no, we run across the page, and we see Bolingbroke then say, lo, on Wednesday next we solemnly proclaim our coronation, and everyone exits. That's not how the first folio does it, and that's not how your edition does it. In God's name I'll ascend the regal throne. Carlisle says, heaven forbid. And then he makes his prophecy right here. The civil wars that will happen that we know occur in the next tetralogy. And then we have Richard being called into Parliament. We have the crown described as two buckets going up and going down. Northumberland making his accusations. Northumberland making Richard read the articles of impeachment. And then we have Richard contemplating his failures in the mirror. And then we have Bolingbroke say, On Wednesday next, we solemnly set down our coronation. Lords, prepare yourselves. So what's missing in Q1? Well, the deposition is missing. 164 lines are missing. The actual pageant. Now, why? Some have argued for censorship reasons. Others have argued that the deposition is a revision added to the text. The deposition finally appears in Q4. So that means that between Q1, which was published in 1597, and Q4, which was published in 1608, it took 11 years before the deposition would be printed. So in Q1, there is no deposition scene. But there's also no coronation scene either. Both scenes obviously happen off screen. Now, when Richard meets his queen, it's a beautiful scene that undoes Henry's lies about some sort of homosexual relation with his flatterer. And on the page in Q1, there is some ambiguity. She first says, "Here, let us rest if this rebellious earth have any resting for her true king's queen. Enter Richard." And then she talks about her King Richard, and then Richard appears. And it says Richard in the speech prefix. And then the queen says, "What is my Richard both in shape and mind?" And then he says, prefix king, "A king of beasts indeed." There's an ambiguity here. What is the printer telling us about Richard as king and Richard as person? Now, by the time Henry reappears complaining about his son to Percy, there is a change as well in his speech prefix. "Enter the king with his nobles. King H, can no man tell me of my unthrifty son?" And then we have also, "Where's the king? King H, what means our cousin?" And then at bottom it says, "King, withdraw yourselves." Almerel asks, "Where's the king?" And the king conventionally would refer to Richard, and the printer writes, for the speech prefix, "King H," to clarify what King Almerel's talking about. So what does that mean? It means the coronation has already taken place off screen. And what about Richard when he's alone in his cell before he's murdered? Enter Richard alone. "Richard, I've been studying how I may compare this prison where I live unto the world." In one way, you can see why the first folio, your version, sticks with the simple speech prefixes of Richard and Henry. The play pushes at the boundaries of the conventional uses of speech prefixes, where king and queen suffice. Here it's also ambiguous. It seems as if the printers don't know what to do. They're interpreting the text for us. Now, I'm saying the printers because Greenblatt argues that the first folio is probably a prompt book. A prompt book is comparable to our Hollywood shooting script. In other words, the theory goes, it was based on a script used for the actual production of the play. So simplicity dictates easy to understand speech prefixes should be used for both the actors and producers. In either case, the quartos reveal an ambiguity at the heart of the play and force not only readers but also printers to interpret the shifting positions. Now remember, Hamlet recognized this. Remember what he said to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern when they asked for Polonius's body? "The body is with the king, but the king is not with the body. The king is a thing." "A thing, my lord?" "Of nothing." Substitute thing for name. The king is a name of nothing.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.